Hi, welcome back to the Wednesday night Bible study. We're in installment number 9 on the story of David. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 25. We're going to go through a few chapters of 1 Samuel today. This is Danger and Losing Focus, I'm calling it. Last week we talked about anger and revenge, a story from 1 Samuel chapter 25. David's anger and wanting to take revenge on a rancher who didn't want to pay up for the efforts of David and his men. David had murder on the mind, and that was his intent. But it was also a story about the wisdom of a woman, Abigail. We were left wondering if her quick action and wise words were useful in saving lives and saving David from himself. Let's continue the story with 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 32. Abigail, remember, gave her speech and waits for David's response. She's a stranger to David. She's a woman. She's the wife of his new enemy, the one he wants to kill, he and his whole household. Is she going to be ignored? Is her life in danger? Let's see, verse 32. David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him, and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." So the conflict is avoided. Murder is avoided. David's anger is over. He's at peace with himself. He's at peace with Nabal. He's at peace with Abigail. Thanks largely to the wisdom of Abigail and God putting Abigail in his life. This whole story teaches to me a valuable lesson, a couple lessons. When conflicts arise, be wise. When conflicts arise, be wise. Take time to think. Take time to pray. And the second one, which was, listen when you hear good advice. God could be speaking through that person. Listen when you hear good advice. Okay. There's a little more to the story. Verse 36, when Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing until daybreak. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things. And his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. So the one who had a heart of stone became like a stone. David was spared any more trouble from Nabal, but it was God who orchestrated it. And then the very happy ending continues in verse 39. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." Then David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, "David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife." She bowed down with her face to the ground and said, "Here is your maidservant, ready to serve you and wash the feet of my master's servants." Kind of a weird colloquialism, wash the feet of my master's servants. Abigail quickly got on a donkey and, attended by her 5 maids, went with David's messengers and became his wife. So the happy ending is Abigail accepted David's marriage proposal, and we see an example of the two placing their trust in God. That story of David and Abigail has had quite a profound effect on Sharon and myself. We even had a couple of lovebirds when we lived in a different town, and we named them David and Abigail. Isn't that sweet? All right. Now let's take a look at the situation between David and Saul. That was kind of a sidetrack from that whole thing going on. Saul had apparently had a change of heart at En-Gedi. He was not pursuing David. We talked about that last time. But could Saul be trusted? It's possible that David always had Saul in the back of his mind. Saul's desire or goal to destroy David always lurked in the shadows. Kind of like a pendulum. Saul's mood might swing at any moment. The chase might resume any time. And that's what happened in chapter 26. Now, I'm not going to go verse by verse, but let me give you the gist. Saul again called out 3,000 chosen troops to hunt down David and his men. Remember, there were about 400 of them, well outnumbered. David had another tempting opportunity to kill Saul in chapter 26. This time, David crept into Saul's camp while they were sleeping, and he took Saul's spear and water jug as proof of his mercy. When Saul realized the second time how close he had come to death, he broke off the chase of David again. And Saul said in verse 21 of chapter 26, "I have sinned," said Saul. "Come back, David, my son. Because you considered my life precious today, I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and have erred greatly." So again they went their own ways. Once again, God helped deliver the vastly outnumbered David. But you have to figure David was getting exhausted, that David was nearing the limits of his endurance, probably running out of hiding places. And you had to consider that he had to consider his 600 men, their wives and children. He now has 600 men with him. So how long was God going to keep David on the run? Can you imagine, and you're in that situation, this has been going on for so long, can you imagine how you might be slipping into despair? In fact, David wrote these words in Psalm 13. "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me?" Got to be pretty despairing. There is nothing morally or spiritually wrong with having feelings of despair. But we can fall into disobedience when we take matters into our own hands. When we do things of our own choosing to, quote, fix things, unquote. And that's what David did, what we're about to read. We'll read about it beginning in 1 Samuel chapter 27. David thought to himself, "One of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand." We know the Philistines are a sworn enemy of Israel. Goliath was a Philistine. In the past, when David had troubles, he would consult God. It seems out of character for him to do what he did here. The writer of these verses makes a point to make a distinction here. It says he thought to himself. So he looked within for direction, looking only from his limited human point of view. David missed God's perspective and lost his confidence. Here's the man who killed Goliath, who escaped Saul many times, say, "One of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. I'm not going to trust in God's protection. I'm not even going to ask God for guidance. I have to take things into my own hands. I have to escape." I can understand, we can hopefully understand David's anxiety and fear. A madman like Saul breathing down your neck with an army of 3,000 is not an easy thing to face all the time. But David was focusing only on his dire situation. He was not focusing on his Savior, the one who promised in the past to make him king of Israel. He had that promise. He used to have that trust in God. If God had made that promise covenant with David, wouldn't God follow through? Wouldn't he follow through and protect him in the meantime? But David on his own concluded that his life was over in Judah. Was it really the best choice to go live with Israel's enemy? Couldn't he stay where he was and continue to trust the one who protected him? Couldn't he at least wait on the Lord for direction on where to go? He didn't do these things. Let's read what he did do. So David and the 600 men who with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maoch, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. So according to that last verse, it did work. Saul called off his search for David. But look what David has done. He went and settled with the enemy Philistines. Worse yet, he settled in Gath, Goliath's hometown. It was a center of pagan idolatry. David and his men made their home among some of God's vilest enemies. And this wasn't just something David did alone. Remember, he took his 2 wives. He also took his 600 men and their families. If this didn't work out, it wasn't just David who was affected. But it gets worse. In verse 5, then David said to Achish, "If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" So on that day Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory a year and 4 months. So he lived with the Philistines a year and 4 months. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement. But more troubling is what David said to this king of the Philistines, what he just said here. David, remember, he's the anointed king of Israel, called himself the servant of Achish. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you? David wasn't really free. He just traded one master for another. As a payment for his protection, Achish expected loyalty in return. David was in a tough spot. On one hand, he had to keep Achish convinced he was a Philistine. At the same time, he couldn't let the Hebrews think he was a traitor. So what did he do? In verse 8, now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these peoples had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels, and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. So David raided Judah's enemies in the south. They weren't Hebrews. That way he demonstrated his loyalty to the Hebrews. And I'm sure the people of Judah were pleased. But what would he say when he got back to the king? When Achish asked, "Where did you go raiding today?" David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah." That's the south country. The south country of Judah, or the south country of Jerahmeel, or the south country of the Kenites. He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us and say, "This is what David did." And such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, "He has become so odious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant forever." So did you catch that? He told the king he was raiding in the south country of Judah, so Achish would believe David was fighting his own people, but in fact he was not fighting his own people. David wasn't being honest and forthright. He was being deceitful, and he was even careful there would be no witnesses. Notice in verse 12 it said that Achish trusted David and thought of David as his loyal servant. It says early on in the next chapter, chapter 28, that Achish even wanted to make David his bodyguard for life. Okay. We are winding down here. I don't want to get too far into it. But Achish also told David they were preparing for another war with Israel, that the Philistines were preparing a war with Israel. So all this deceit was about to backfire on David. David was going to have to take part in it on the wrong side. He would have to fight with the Philistines against the Israelites. So much for going it your own way. And we'll have to wait next time to see what happens. In the meantime, take care, be safe, and may the Lord be with you.